Welcome to the Spitzen-Körper Thelema. We are in the 5th century before the Common Era, and a man from Kasane, a minor city of Ionia that had already fallen under Persian dominion, arrives at Athens during the year of Salamis with a single ambition, to rewrite what it means to think about the physical world. His name is Anaxagoras, and he will become the first philosopher to establish himself in Athens, the first to teach that the sun is not a god but a burning stone, and the first to suffer legal persecution for saying so. The archive holds him not as a mere ancient physicist but as a turning point in Western esotericism itself. The moment when the Ionic school's materialistic inheritance collided with the Pythagorean and Orphic understanding of spirit as generative principle. John Burnet's early Greek philosophy, published in 1892 and revised through 3 editions, remains the most rigorous textual reconstruction of Anaxagoras available in English scholarship. Burnet worked from the fragments preserved by later doxographers, the biographical accounts of Diogenes Laertius, and the living testimony embedded in Plato's dialogues. What he recovered was not merely a proto-scientist but a philosopher whose central claim, that mind, or nous, orders all things, became the invisible spine of Renaissance magic, Hermetic philosophy, and the entire Western esoteric project. Helena Blavatsky, writing in The Secret Doctrine decades after Burnet, recognized in Anaxagoras the transmitter of the Humana Mundi teaching, the world-soul doctrine, and saw in his persecution the eternal pattern, the free thinker silenced by democratic rabble and the fear of transcendental knowledge. The text before us is Burnet's biographical and philosophical treatment of Anaxagoras, his chronology, his lineage, his trial, his singular doctrine. We are reading the archivist's account of a man who believed that since the spiritual prototypes of all things are differentiations of Father Ether, the one element, all things are essentially the same. This is not the teaching of Democritus, whom Anaxagoras directly opposed. Democritus advanced a purely mechanical universe of atoms and void. Anaxagoras countered with something more occult, the proposition that matter itself was never truly separated from spirit, that all apparent multiplicity flows from an underlying unity governed by divine intelligence. The falling meteorite at Aegospotamos in 468–67 BC became the pivot upon which his cosmology turned, evidence that the heavens themselves obey rational, knowable law rather than divine whim. This was both a triumph of reason and a heresy. All that Apollodorus tells us with regard to the date of Anaxagoras seems to rest on the authority of Demetrios Phalereus, who said of him, in his Register of Archons, that he began to be a philosopher at Athens at the age of 20, in the archonship of Callias or Calliades, 480–79 BC. This date was probably derived from a calculation based on the philosopher's age at the time of his trial, which Demetrios had every opportunity of learning from sources no longer extant. Apollodorus inferred that Anaxagoras was born in LXX, 500–496 BC, and he adds that he died at the age of 72 in LXXVII, 428–27 BC. He doubtless thought it natural that he should not survive Pericles, and that he should die the year Plato was born. We have a further statement, of doubtful origin, but probably due also to Demetrios, that Anaxagoras lived at Athens for 30 years. If it is correct, we get from about 480 to 450 BC as the time he lived there. There can be no doubt that these dates are very nearly right. Aristotle tells us that Anaxagoras was older than Empedocles, who was probably born before 490 BC, and Theophrastus said that Empedocles was born not long after Anaxagoras. Democritus, too, said that he himself was a young man in the old age of Anaxagoras, and he must have been born about 460 BC. Anaxagoras was from Klasomene, and Theophrastos tells us that his father's name was Hegesibolos. The tradition was that he neglected his possessions to follow science. It is certain, at any rate, that already in the 4th century he was regarded as the type of the man who leads the theoretic life. Of course, the story of his contempt for worldly goods was seized on later by the historical novelist and tricked out with the usual apothegms. These do not concern us here. One incident belonging to the early manhood of Anaxagoras is recorded, namely, the fall of a huge meteoric stone into the Aigos Potamos in 468–67 BC. Our authorities tell us he predicted this phenomenon, which is plainly absurd. But we shall see reason to believe that it may have occasioned one of his most striking departures from the earlier cosmology, and led to his adoption of the very view for which he was condemned at Athens. At all events, the fall of the stone made a profound impression at the time, and it was still shown to tourists in the days of Pliny and Plutarch. The doxographers speak of Anaxagoras as the pupil of Anaximenes. This can hardly be correct. Anaximenes most probably died before Anaxagoras was born. But it is not enough to say that the statement arose from the fact that the name of Anaxagoras followed that of Anaximenes in the successions. We have its original source in a fragment of Theophrastos himself, which states that Anaxagoras had been an associate of the philosophy of Anaximenes. Now this expression has a very distinct meaning if we accept the view as to schools of science set forth in the introduction. It means that the old Ionic school survived the destruction of Miletos in 494 BC, and continued to flourish in the other cities of Asia. It means, further, that it produced no man of distinction after its third great representative, and that the philosophy of Anaximenes was still taught by whoever was now at the head of the society. At this point, then, it may be well to indicate briefly the conclusions we shall come to in the next few chapters with regard to the development of philosophy during the first half of the 5th century BC. We shall find that, while the old Ionic school was still capable of training great men, it was now powerless to keep them. Anaxagoras went his own way, Melissos and Leucippos, though they still retained enough of the old views to bear witness to the source of their inspiration, were too strongly influenced by the Eleatic dialectic to remain content with the theories of Anaximenes. It was left to second-rate minds like Diogenes to champion the orthodox system, while third-rate minds like Hippon of Samos went back to the cruder theory of Thales. The details of this anticipatory sketch will become clearer as we go on. For the present, it is only necessary to call the reader's attention to the fact that the old Ionic philosophy now forms a sort of background to our story, just as Orphic and Pythagorean religious ideas have done in the preceding chapters. Anaxagoras was the first philosopher to take up at his abode at Athens. We are not informed what brought him there in the year of Salamis. He was, however, a Persian subject, for Clazomenae had been reduced after the suppression of the Ionian revolt, and it seems likely enough that he was in the Persian army. Anaxagoras is said to have been the teacher of Pericles, and the fact is placed beyond the reach of doubt by the testimony of Plato. In the Phaedrus he makes Socrates say, "For all arts that are great, there is need of talk and discussion on the parts of natural science that deal with things on high, for that seems to be the source which inspires high-mindedness and effectiveness in every direction." Pericles added this very acquirement to his original gifts. He fell in, it seems, with Anaxagoras, who was a scientific man, and, satiating himself with the theory of things on high, and having attained to a knowledge of the true nature of mind and intellect, which was just what the discourses of Anaxagoras were mainly about, he drew from that source whatever was of a nature to further him in the art of speech. This clearly means that Pericles associated with Anaxagoras before he became a prominent politician. So too Isocrates says that Pericles was the pupil of two sophists, Anaxagoras and Damon. There can be no doubt that the teaching of Damon belongs to the youth of Pericles, and it is to be inferred that the same is true of that of Anaxagoras. A more difficult question is the alleged relation of Euripides to Anaxagoras. The oldest authority for it is Alexander of Aetolia, poet and librarian, who lived at the court of Ptolemy Philadelphos, c. 280 BC. He referred to Euripides as the nursling of brave Anaxagoras. The famous fragment on the blessedness of the scientific life might just as well refer to any other cosmologist as to Anaxagoras, and indeed suggests more naturally a thinker of more primitive type. On the other hand, it is likely enough that Anaxagoras did not develop his system all at once, and he doubtless began by teaching that of Anaximenes. Besides, there is one fragment which distinctly expounds the central thought of Anaxagoras, and could hardly be referred to anyone else. It is clear that, if we adopt the chronology of Demetrios of Phaleron, the trial of Anaxagoras must be placed early in the political career of Pericles. That is the tradition preserved by Soteros, who says that the accuser was Thucydides, son of Melesias, and that the charge was impiety and medism. As Thucydides was ostracized in 443 BC, that would make it probable that the trial of Anaxagoras took place about 450 BC, and would bring it into connection with the ostracism of the other teacher of Pericles, Damon. If that is so, we understand at once why Plato never makes Socrates meet with Anaxagoras. He had handed his school over to Archelaus before Socrates was old enough to take an interest in scientific theories. We do learn from Plato, however, what the charge of impiety was based on. It was that Anaxagoras taught the sun was a red-hot stone, and the moon earth, and we shall see that he certainly did hold these views. For the rest, the most likely account is that he was got out of prison and sent away by Pericles. We know that such things were possible at Athens. Driven from his adopted home, Anaxagoras naturally went back to Ionia, where at least he would be free to teach what he pleased. He settled at Lampsacos, a colony of Meltos, and we shall see reason to believe that he founded a school there. If so, he must have lived at Lampsacos for some time before his death. The Lampsacanes erected an altar to his memory in their marketplace, dedicated to mind and truth. What Burnet has recovered for us is the architecture of a collapse and a birth. Anaxagoras inherited the Ionic tradition, the assumption that all things arise from a single material principle, that nature obeys law, that reason can penetrate its secrets. But he saw in the meteorite and in his own cosmological calculations something that the older Ionians had missed, the necessity of mind as an organizing principle. Matter alone cannot explain order. The apparent multiplicity of things, the infinite divisibility Burnet hints at when he speaks of portions and seeds, demands a unifying intelligence. This was not a regression to mythology. It was a rational intuition that became the foundation of Western esotericism. When Anaxagoras taught that the sun is a stone, he was claiming the right to demystify, to apply reason to the celestial realm. But when he taught that Nu orders all things, he was claiming that reason itself is divine, immanent, and accessible to the philosopher who undertakes the theoretic life. His trial for impiety was not incidental to his philosophy. It was the necessary collision between a teaching that places divine intelligence in the visible, knowable world and a religious establishment that required the gods to remain transcendent, inaccessible, and politically useful. He was expelled from Athens because he made the mistake of being right too early. Burnet's scholarship shows us that Anaxagoras did not die in obscurity. He founded a school. The lamp was passed to Archelaus, and through him to others whose names we have lost. But the new doctrine entered the bloodstream of Western thought, and through Plato and the Neoplatonists, it became the hidden architecture of Hermetic philosophy, of Kabbalism, of Renaissance magic. What was condemned in 5th century Athens as impiety became, by the time of the Italian Renaissance, the hidden basis of all serious occult theory. Next, Plato, Timaeus. The Spitzen-Körper Thelema. If this archive serves you, support it on Patreon. Link in the description.